Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 167, Up the Coast. Last time Vasco da Gama finally bested the Cape of Good Hope and rounded the southern coast of Africa. He had done it. In December of 1497, da Gama became the first European to sail into the Indian Ocean. Sadly, the nautical distance from the Cape of Good Hope to India is still 8,000-ish kilometers. So he still had a long way to go. Today, we follow da Gama as he sails up the coast in the hope of finding the sources of the spices and, I guess, maybe you never know. Perhaps Priester John, too. Christmas Day 1497 passed in prayers before the shipboard shrines. The cartographers were now out of charts. Literally, all that lay before da Gama and his two ships were blanks on a piece of paper that needed to be filled in. And it was up to them to do that. Moreover, the need to find land and put to it was growing increasingly urgent. The cooks were now so low on drinking water that they had taken to boiling the salted meat in seawater, which is disgusting. On January the 11th, the watchkeepers sighted a small river on the coast. Next to the river was a large group of people. Evidently word as to the ships had gotten around. Da Gama sent a boat ashore with his usual gifts. This time, a fancy red jacket for the chief. The next morning, said chief reappeared with two men and the gift of several chickens. He told da Gama he would take them to their commander, which da Gama assumed was the king of this land that the Portuguese had named, quote-unquote, the land of good people, in honor of those that they had met. Those who went ashore quickly deduced that they were on the verge of more developed lands. Here, the warriors used iron-tipped spears, arrows, daggers with iron sheaths. Both men and women wore copper ornaments. Moreover, they witnessed how the native peoples dried salt water in pools to collect the leftover salt. The native peoples kindly gave the Portuguese several new casks of fresh water. But before the sailors could explore this land further, a favorable wind blew up, and da Gama determined to move on. After 9 more days of sailing, the ships reached a much larger river where they stayed for 32 days. While East Africa thus far seemed to be a kind of paradise, the sailors remained vulnerable to the types of sicknesses that frequented ships in the pre-modern period. Around this time, the dreaded scurvy struck. Many sailors' gums puffed up so much that they were unable to eat. There were no doctors on the ship. So try as he might, Paulo da Gama, Vasco's brother, was helpless as the men suffered. Ultimately, 30 dying of the ailment. Vasco da Gama, equally perplexed as to how to deal with the disease, finally gave the order to just move on, after erecting another pillar to mark their place. The ships reached the open sea on the 24th of February, 1498, and the pilots set northeasterly course to keep clear of the mainland. On March the 1st, they came upon a group of islands. Unaware of the danger, Paulo's ship ran itself aground on a sandbar. As they were struggling to move the vessel, a flotilla of small boats sailed out to meet them. To the horror of those on board, the men rowing out towards them blew long, straight trumpets, the same kind used by the Muslims of North Africa. As the boats drew nearer, the crew could now hear the men clearly conversing in Arabic, and they prepared for the worst. But to the pleasant surprise of the crew, they were friendly, which definitely cut against the European stereotype of Muslims at the time. The chief wore a long linen tunic and had an imposing retinue, but they clearly meant the travelers no harm. Da Gama tried to ply the chief off with cheap trinkets, but these men would have none of it, and they scoffed at the baubles he offered. Through his translator, Da Gama learned that they wanted rich scarlet cloth. Da Gama told the men that he had none of that, and they left, disappointed. The men did come back several times. However, through these contacts, Da Gama learned that they were in a land called Mozambique, and that the well-dressed men were merchants who tended to trade with the Arabs. More importantly, Da Gama learned that the location of the precious spices was not that far off. At least, not so far off as these men had traded with the same Arabs who brought the spices to Europe. They told Da Gama that there was a huge island populated by half Christians and half Muslims, and that the two groups were constantly at war and it was nearby. Of course, Da Gama assumed this meant that they were nearing Priester John. He asked if he could procure 2 pilots for hire that might guide them to India, men who knew the Indian coast. The chief agreed. But as Da Gama once more prepared to set sail, he was struck by how little the 2 pilots could tell him about India. They seemed to know almost nothing. Then, in the dead of the night, one of the pilots escaped the ship and swam back to the islands. Da Gama, the other pilot in tow, made after the man. As they neared the islands, though, a group of armed Muslims set sail in small boats heading straight for them. Da Gama wheeled around and rowed with all haste back to the main ship. There, he immediately ordered the crew to fire the cannons. Cannonballs roared through the air toward the ships, which turned and fled. What Da Gama did not realize at the moment was the significance of what just happened. For the first time in history, Muslims and Christians had come to blows on the Indian Ocean. It was a sign of things to come. 2 days later, the ships were once more cruising past a cape backed by high mountains. But the tides could be treacherous, for, as the crew woke the next morning, they realized that the tide had dragged them all the way back past the Mozambique Islands. Literally, all their efforts over the past 2 days had been reversed. Clearly, they still had a lot to learn about sailing in the Indian Ocean. When word reached the Muslim leader that the Christians had somehow returned, he sent out one boat with a message of friendship. Again, Da Gama trusted the men sent to him. But as they sailed, under the direction of these new pilots, around the island chain, a curious thing kept happening. Wherever they went with their new friends, natives rushed to the shore brandishing weapons. Da Gama quickly came to the conclusion that the men that they were trusting were little more than pirates. But it was too late to change course. Coming upon one town, Da Gama, after meeting with his captains, determined to either just fire on the town and raid the supplies they needed, or at the very least send a message that they weren't to be messed with. While the natives tried to hide behind a hastily prepared palisade, it did little good against the Portuguese cannons, which relentlessly pounded the coastal village for 3 hours. The next day, the shore did appear deserted. Da Gama gambled that his efforts worked and put ashore, where the men quickly refilled their water casks, and the ships got underway once more. Oh, I should mention, got away once more, not before shelling the town. One good time. For good measure? On March 29th, the wind finally blew the ships north. The Arab pilots still with them. Yes, they kept the pirate pilots, even though the record is clear. Da Gama thought the man was lying to them, so why he kept him, I truly have no idea. But anyway, the pilot on April the 1st guided them to an archipelago that the guide insisted was part of the coast. Da Gama did not believe him and had the men flogged. Again, why he keeps this guy at this point is an utter mystery to me, but whatever. To commemorate the event, the Portuguese named the nearest island the Island of the Flogged Man. Cue eye roll. The ships pressed on, and now the pilot, the record is unclear as to whether or not it was the flogged one, directed the men to a large island. The two ships pulled alongside each other and waited about a mile or so offshore. By dawn, however, the tide had fallen, and the São Rafael found itself stuck on a sandy shoal. The locals paddled out to the trapped vessel and traded the men oranges for some of their trinkets. Da Gama immediately pronounced the oranges better fruit than anything that they had back home. When the tide rose, the ship finally made its way once more. Little did Da Gama realize at the time, the date was April the 7th, 1498, and he had just reached Mombasa, in modern-day Kenya. With many sailors sick from scurvy, Da Gama placed a watch and ordered the men to bed with the ships at anchor. Around midnight, the watch called out. A massive ship called a Doe was rowing toward them, carrying around 100 armed men. A Doe, which is spelled D-H-O-W, by the way, is simply a catch-all term for a rigged ship, often with lateen sails, that predominantly sailed in the Indian Ocean. Da Gama barked out orders as the armed men tried to board the ship. Portuguese soldiers worked quickly to block their way as the gunners hurriedly loaded the cannons. At this range, Da Gama could not hope to hit the vessels, but the blast might frighten the assailants. But after the initial sally, things calmed down, and Da Gama turned from general to diplomat. 4 unarmed men were ultimately allowed aboard to talk. Da Gama gave them food and apologized for his conduct, saying he was merely a foreigner and did not understand local customs. The men replied jovially that they always carried arms and merely wanted to see the ship up close. Whether that was true, we don't know. Da Gama certainly did not believe them. He assumed that they had come to try to take over one of the ships, and only now that the plan failed were they changing their story. Regardless, they said they came on behalf of the Sultan, who would have come himself if it were not so late. And the next morning, crates of gifts did arrive, containing goats, oranges, lemons, and sugarcane. Da Gama was pleased and sent 2 of his men ashore to thank the Sultan and, of course, to reconnoiter. The Sultan received these men with hospitality, and he ordered his men to show them around the city. It turned out that there were many Christians in Mombasa. In fact, their Muslim guides told the 2 men that they would meet many more Christians once the ships docked, and Da Gama himself came to the shore. Da Gama received these reports with delight. After talking it over with his captains, he determined to put into the port and stock up on spices now, just in case anything went wrong in India. After all, it's the early modern period, so there's no such thing as too many spices. The fleet weighed anchor, but the São Gabriel drifted into a shoal. The other ship hit it, and both dropped anchors again to sort it all out. The shoal, however, turned out to be a godsend. As soon as the ships dropped anchors, the men from Mozambique, thinking this was as close as the Christians would get to the shore, rushed to the stern, dove into the water, and swam for shore. Not everyone escaped, though. Da Gama, sensing that a plot was afoot, decided to interrogate the remaining men under torture. It was, standard medieval logic still prevailing at the time, that men tended to speak truthfully once they were tortured. So Da Gama had boiling hot oil poured over the men's skin. In between gasps and cries of pain, the men confessed that, hearing of Da Gama's actions further down the coast, the plan was to capture the ships the moment Da Gama came into port. Da Gama gave thanks to God for saving his crews. The 2 tortured men, by the way, wrenched free from their captors and threw themselves suicidally into the ocean as soon as they could. On October 13th, Da Gama ordered the fleet to set sail, still not sure how to get to India. 30 leagues from Mombasa, the Portuguese, mapping this all as they went, found themselves before another sizable town. At sunset, they anchored outside said town, now being sure to be on the lookout for any sign of attack. On April 15th, the Portuguese were able to seize several men from a fishing vessel that had the bad fortune of passing too close to one of the Portuguese ships, and Da Gama went about interrogating them. Men said that they were from the city of Malindi. They told Da Gama that they had just come from Malindi, where 4 Christian ships had only just now come into port. If Da Gama would release them, the men promised to return to Malindi and procure Christian pilots to help the Portuguese reach India. Da Gama, desperate for something to go his way, moved the ships around 1 league, so about 3.5 miles from the shore. The locals kept their distance this time, perhaps realizing that Da Gama had a tendency to just, kidnap whoever came too close. Da Gama decided not to trust sending his men to the shore just yet. Instead, they rowed one of their captives out in a canoe about 500 feet from the shore and left him there. Back on the ship, the Portuguese still held his younger wife, who was with him in the fishing vessel when they were taken, as an insurance policy that the man would do as he was told. He did. He told the Sultan, which is the term I will generally use to denote the person in charge of these small city-states, by the way, that these men were newcomers and the subjects of a great and powerful king, and that the Sultan should want these men as his allies and friends. He informed the Sultan that these men were going to India, that they would be most grateful for a pilot who could take them. The Sultan nodded approvingly. For once, Da Gama had found someone willing to listen. Malindi happened to be at war with nearby Mombasa, and the Sultan was eager for new allies, especially those with powerful new weapons. To show his appreciation, the Sultan ordered a ship sent out to Da Gama loaded with sheep, cloves, cumin, ginger, nutmeg, and pepper. Da Gama was ecstatic. The messengers with the gifts told Da Gama that if he came ashore, he could stay with the Sultan in his palace, and all the men could refresh themselves after their journey. Afterward, the Sultan promised he would visit the ships. Da Gama demurred. He had learned that it was far too dangerous for him to set foot on Muslim soil, no matter how nice the people seemed. He thanked the messengers, but told them that his king had forbade him from setting foot on foreign soil. King Manuel had certainly not, and that doing so would violate his king's orders. It would not. Ultimately, so eager was the Sultan for aid that he came aboard the ship anyway and met with Da Gama in person. The meeting was a spectacular success, at least as far as Da Gama was concerned. Da Gama explained his mission at length and answered all of the Sultan's questions. The Sultan told Da Gama all about the Red Sea, the spices he might want to trade for in India, and how to get there. Crucially, he also promised to provide them with a pilot. The next morning, Da Gama rowed along the shore in a boat to see the city. He had learned that only Arabs lived in the city, and that of those were only around 4,000. Native Africans, on the other hand, lived outside the city and worked on the plantations. Though intermarriage and most certainly the rape of slaves was so common that Da Gama later confessed he really could not tell Africans from Arabs. This all went on for about a week. Da Gama, or sometimes his brother, would row out for fetes, pretend fights, and to hear musical performances. Eventually, Da Gama started to get impatient. On April 22nd, when the royal dhow came out bearing one of the Sultan's counselors, Da Gama had the man seized. He sent a message back that he wanted his pilot and he wanted him now. He demanded that the Sultan send a pilot or he would keep the counselor as a permanent captive. The Sultan had clearly hoped that he might be able to divert the Portuguese long enough to enlist them in his new war. But now, seeing that he was out of cards to play, the Sultan sent the pilot and the counselor was released. To da Gama's immense pleasure, the man appeared to be another Christian from India. He was clearly an experienced navigator and showed da Gama maps and charts of India's coastline and explained the best currents and winds for getting the two ships across the Indian Ocean. He was also totally unimpressed with European sailing technology. He told da Gama that his astrolabe was out of date and that those who sailed the Red Sea had been using instruments like those for centuries. Instead, he took out an Indian tool for determining latitude and he said it was better. Da Gama didn't argue. Instead, he let him have his way and use his own device. He didn't care, so long as he got to India. Finally, on April 24th, the ship set sail. 2 days later, the African coast receded into the distance until it disappeared. 3 nights after that, the ships passed over the equator, and the familiar pole star reappeared. That was the only thing that would have been familiar to the men aboard these ships. They were sailing where no European had ever sailed before. They held their course to the northeast. In India. If you've enjoyed the show, consider leaving a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening. And if you've really enjoyed the show and would like more content, visit our website, westerncivpodcast.com, or consider becoming a patron. For only $1 a month, you get every single episode early. For $2 a month, you get every single deep dive episode, author interview, and a side that I may do. There's over 25 additional hours of content available at this point, with about 3 to 4 new hours every single month. More information available at patreon.com/Western Civ Podcast. Link in the show notes.